Now, our next presenter is James Miller. He comes to us from the LDS Church History Department, and his presentation is entitled "To Every Tongue, the Church Language Policy." Originally from Las Vegas, Nevada, James' interest in all things related to Eastern Europe began when he started studying Russian at Brigham Young University in 2006. He later served as a missionary for the church from 2007 to 2009 in the Ukraine Kyiv mission before returning to BYU, where he completed his undergraduate studies in international relations and Russian this past year in 2013. James began working in the church history department in 2012 as an intern, assisting in the church's efforts to decentralize the work of collecting, preserving, and sharing Mormon history. He currently works full-time in the department's Global Support and Acquisitions Division, helping acquire and then catalog historical records about the church in Europe and Africa. During his time in the church history department, he has also conducted research about the church in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries. And recently he published an article, or recently the church, we should say, not he did. The church published an article that he wrote about the church in Russia in the February 2014 church magazines. In 2012, he married his wife, Elena. Now, to pronounce the name, is I all right? Just Elena's good enough? All right. And she's a native of Minsk, Belarus. They now have one daughter. Do you pronounce her name? Sophia? And she was just born this past December. So we look forward to hearing from you, James.
About a month after first arriving in Latvia, missionaries from the Russian St. Petersburg mission, assigned to Riga, decided to set up a street display about the church to find new potential converts. After setting up the display in a public area and beginning to talk to people, an uproar ensued among the Latvians passing by. The missionaries' chosen location was the Freedom Monument, a memorial honoring Latvian independence, but the missionaries' display and materials were in Russian, the language that ethnic Latvians considered the language of the former occupiers. Boris Schiel, an ethnic Latvian who had recently returned to the country with his wife as a senior missionary, was able to diffuse the situation somewhat by explaining these missionaries had studied Russian in America. But even if the missionaries had understood the national sensitivities that they just defended and had even chosen a different location, Russian would have remained their only way to communicate with the Latvians that they had met. This episode and many more like it from the history of the church in the former Soviet Union demonstrate the role that language plays in the church's ability to fulfill its divinely appointed mission to take the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Indeed, since the church's 19th century founding in America, reaching this intended global audience has not only required overcoming geographic and political barriers, but also straddling the linguistic divides that greatly define the world in which we live. The policies and practices of the church adopted by the church to approach these linguistic challenges, which I collectively refer to as church language policy, guide the church's efforts to share its message, enable its ability to grow, and enable converts to learn and internalize the gospel message. While the church has no single codified language policy, it does have documented approaches to issues such as translation, missionary language training, and organizing church members along linguistic lines. These three aspects of policy and practice not only guide the church's efforts to overcome communication barriers, but also affect how Latter-day Saints view themselves within the global church and associate with each other. Language, after all, is not only grammar and syntax, but also an integral part of personal, cultural, and national identity. And it can even overlay or reinforce other divisions between peoples of different tongues. And Europe's conflict-filled past certainly attests to these roles of language. The imperial powers that once ruled the region often targeted and suppressed the use of local languages and dialects while imposing their own as a way of binding the subjected population on the periphery to the imperial core. The Russian Empire in particular pursued assimilation policies in its borderlands to make local elites and society more Russian. Later under Stalin, the Soviet Union renewed and intensified these policies. The regime, fearful of perceived foreign-backed separatist plots and nationalist movements in the Soviet borderlands, targeted various nationalities through terror, murder, and mass deportations. Ethnic Russians were also relocated to non-Russian areas to supply needed manpower for industry and to influence local political leadership. The regime also promoted a common Soviet, largely Russian-based identity intended to supersede the country's diverse national and ethnic identities. Discriminatory policies and attitudes in state and party institutions made Russian the language of opportunity in career pursuits and education. Consequentially, by the end of the Soviet period, many non-Russians, especially in urban areas, could speak or understand Russian, and some even completely adopted it in place of their ethnic language. As the church began to expand into this region, the availability of the Book of Mormon and other basic materials in Russian allowed the church to spread quickly into several nations, establishing branches in areas marked by the legacy of Russian-Soviet language policy. This Russo-centric approach, however, placed limitations on the church's outreach. Centrally established translation policies subsequently resulted in delays in the availability of scripture and basic materials in other national languages, complicating missionaries' efforts to share the gospel and exposing the church and its members to the political tensions in society around them. Now, first, a word about translation. Without literature, especially the scriptures, in a language accessible by members and potential converts, the church would neither grow nor help individuals internalize the gospel message. While translation policy covers a wide range of issues from the Sunday school manuals that we use each Sunday to the content on the internet, I'll focus mostly today on scripture translation. And by the time the church had reached Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, church translation in general had evolved into a very centrally controlled, organized program from its decentralized, uncoordinated origins in the early 20th century. Earlier area leaders organized local translation projects for needed language materials. Eventually, the church developed today's systematic, centralized procedure in which area leaders must first submit official requests to church headquarters for the church's translation division, as it's known now, to begin translating into a needed language. They must explain the need for the new language, whether that need is current or anticipated, and how materials in other languages don't meet the needs of members. Ecclesiastic leaders at church headquarters then review requests with input from the translation division. Scripture translation in particular must go through a stringent approval and review process. The translation division, with authorization, organizes translation teams and ensures that the teams follow the policy set forth by the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 that requires that translations of the standard works be literal translations insofar as possible. The teams, preferably in-country, native-speaking Latter-day Saints, generally include translators who produce the text, content reviewers who check for meaning, language reviewers who correct grammar and technical mistakes. The translation is then proofread, and it also undergoes an ecclesiastic review by a committee of native-speaking local leaders who provide the certification that the translation is doctrinally accurate as well as acceptable to the intended audience. The certifications of the ecclesiastic reviewers are then submitted to the presiding councils in Salt Lake, who approve publication. Regrettably, implementing these policies in the former Soviet Union forced many Latter-day Saints to use scriptures in another language, usually Russian, as they waited years for scriptures in their preferred language to be published. The Baltic states and Armenia, for example, waited nearly a decade for scriptures in their national languages. And while the translation division was authorized to organize translation projects in nearly every former Soviet state reached by the church in the early 90s, legitimate concerns about translation quality and challenges with the teams themselves delayed completion and publication. For example, the church in 1993 organized a translation team in Armenia to work on the Book of Mormon. A local sister named Hasvira Ministerian worked as the primary translator while others reviewed her work. However, disagreements between her and one of the reviewers, as well as questions regarding the quality of her work, resulted in the suspension of the project. Similar challenges delayed the Latvian translation of the Book of Mormon, and quality concerns resulted in lengthy reviews of the Estonian translation. In the meantime, Latter-day Saints in these areas turned to materials in other languages. Many Estonians turned to Finnish, the closest linguistic relative of their language. Most others, however, used Russian, which not everyone could understand equally well. In Armenia, reliance on Russian created a geographic and generational gap in the availability of gospel knowledge. First of all, Armenia was part of the Soviet, and not everyone could understand Russian equally well, especially some from the older generation who had attended school when Russian was not a required subject. The use of Russian also offended some Armenians' national feelings. Moreover, as Missionary, the translator, said herself, if the church is going to spread all over Armenia in villages and other regions, you can't find a lot of people who speak good Russian and understand everything in Russian. Although the church had previously published materials in the Book of Mormon in Western Armenian, spoken by Armenian saints who joined the church in Syria and Turkey in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, only a few Latter-day Saints in Armenia itself, where Eastern Armenian is used, could sufficiently understand it. The eventual publication of Eastern Armenian materials, though, brought relief and greater access to gospel knowledge. Prior to the Armenian project suspension, Missionary had completed an initial translation of the Book of Mormon, which she and members of a new translation team returned to in 1998. The final project was finished and published 2 years later in 2000, and the translation reached Armenia in 2001. A missionary at the time observed, "It has opened so many doors that weren't opened before we received the Book of Mormon in Armenian. It has strengthened people's testimonies in the church and has helped new converts become a lot stronger." This growth ultimately led to the creation of a stake in Armenia in 2013. The wait times for translations in other areas resulted in different outcomes. Prior to the publication of the Book of Mormon in Ukrainian in 1997, the church in Ukraine focused largely on the Russian-speaking portions of the country in the south and east. Only on the eve of its publication were branches established in Western Ukraine and missionaries assigned to those cities where Russian is less accepted. As a result, many Ukrainian converts already had the Book of Mormon available to them in their preferred language when they joined the church. Other Latter-day Saints in other countries, though, are still waiting. Many members in Belarus have long wanted a translation of the Book of Mormon in Belarusian, but the church quickly suspended all translation into the language when it became apparent that most Belarusians, even in the church, know and prefer Russian. Despite a plea from local leaders in Minsk in the early 2000s, there appear to be no plans to restart the program. Language policy issues, however, not only affected local Latter-day Saints. The church's missionary force in the region has remained over the years largely foreign, meaning American, requiring missionaries to learn another language to share the gospel. When missionaries receive their call from Salt Lake, they usually receive a language assignment. In turn, the missionary department oversees language training at missionary training centers. The assignments and the training the missionaries receive, though, as many could attest here, don't always adequately prepare missionaries for the linguistic reality that awaits them in the mission field. Missionaries in the Baltics discovered this as the church expanded its outreach prior to the translation of materials into Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian. Even as they began to receive in-field training in these three languages in 1993, the lack of materials and perceived slow pace of translation frustrated them. Unofficial translations of the missionary lessons in Estonia circulated among missionaries and even were distributed at the Provo Missionary Training Center prior to the release of official translations. And one couple who organized the in-country training in Lithuanian expressed their dissatisfaction with the, quote, bureaucracy of the church by making their own missionary name tags in Lithuanian before the church would authorize any production. The availability of the Book of Mormon in Russian, Finnish, or other foreign languages perhaps presented a greater challenge to missionary outreach. Locals' commands of these languages varied. One former missionary explained, "The hardest thing," she served in Latvia, "the hardest thing is when I sat in a discussion and asked them to read a passage from the Book of Mormon in Russian, and they started to read it, and I could see that they couldn't read. They could not read Russian. They could read the letters, but they didn't understand what they were reading at all. The reliance on Russian thus limited church outreach to a certain extent to ethnic Russians and those who understood Russian and were still willing to use it. Moreover, the presence of many ethnic Russians in society and the church itself meant that neither the church or its missionaries could simply abandon the use of the language. The especially stark language division in the Baltics led church leaders to organize separate branches for speakers of different languages. And the trend of creating branches and wards for speakers of a given language traces back to efforts to proselyte and engage minority language speakers in North America in the mid-20th century. And although church leaders did not intentionally aim to divide people along ethnic lines, they worked to accommodate Latter-day Saints with differing language needs and backgrounds. And while this organizational decision logistically allowed the church to meet the language needs of members, it also, in a way, institutionalized the differences between the Russian and Baltic members. Even as the church taught that all are children of God and thus brothers and sisters, relations between ethnicities became strained. For example, animosity between Estonian-speaking and Russian-speaking branches in Tallinn emerged very early after a dispute over the distribution of humanitarian supplies to the local Latter-day Saints. The language barrier also provided another excuse not to interact with each other. Similar challenges emerged in Riga, Latvia, where initially ethnic Latvians had used Russian at branch meetings to accommodate the Russian members. When some Latvians began to use their native language, however, some Russian members became unhappy because they could not understand. After church leaders organized separate branches in 1994, the language divide further discouraged members of both groups from attending joint activities for a time. In Lithuania, however, relations between the Russian speakers and Lithuanian speakers showed little signs of the tensions present in Riga and Tallinn. In contrast to branches in those cities, the Vilnius branch welcomed both the country's national language and Russian. A former missionary explained, "In Lithuania we had one combined branch, but they had a rule in the branch to speak their own language. So if you were Lithuanian, you spoke Lithuanian in church when you gave a talk. If you were Russian, you spoke Russian in church when you gave a talk." And when the diverse congregation was divided, not by area, but along linguistic lines, some members expressed their dissatisfaction. Missionaries also believed that the mixed language branch had been an example to the rest of the mission of unity. Creating separate language units, though, did not become standard practice outside of the Baltics. In Ukraine, for example, LDS meetings tend to use the most dominant language of the area where they're located, whether it be Ukrainian or Russian. In the central region of the country, where I served my mission, Latter-day Saints use both languages at meetings, sometimes even in the same talk, sometimes even in the same sentence. Challenges with convert retention, however, and activity rates appeared to supersede concerns for language sensitivities in the Baltics in the following years. Branches in cities with few members were not divided, and church leaders repeatedly combined and then divided and then recombined branches in Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius. Most recently, as you can see, the Estonian-speaking and Russian-speaking branches in Tallinn were recombined in early 2013. As the church's efforts to establish itself amidst this confusing linguistic scene show, the church's language policy and its practices can affect growth and the experiences of Latter-day Saints in different ways. Language, as the current situation in Ukraine demonstrates, can both unite and divide, and the way the church approaches language issues can also bring Latter-day Saints together or reinforce divisions between them. The story of the church in Eastern Europe, however, does not only show how language can produce occasional conflict or disruption in the church's growth. It also shows how many Latter-day Saints can come together and endure these discomforts because of their focus on faith. Some missionaries noted that many Russians they taught could read the Book of Mormon in their native language, in contrast to their Estonian, Lithuanian, Latvian neighbors, yet they often refused to do so. The situation echoes the lesson of Old Testament Babel before the tower, when the supposed common language made God's truth equally accessible to all, but the people still rejected it. The willingness of so many to accept the gospel despite the church offering it to them in a different tongue is telling. The church cannot always timely meet the needs of language needs of converts, members, and missionaries. And the gospel message can often transcend earthly barriers quicker than the church's organization can manage. Yet when the church does make the restored gospel to every tongue that desires it, it becomes all the more meaningful to the people that receive it. A missionary serving in the Baltic Mission Office when the Estonian translation of the Book of Mormon arrived insightfully observed, "The Estonian saints are beside themselves waiting for their shipment to arrive. We have some Estonian elders here in Vilnius, where the mission office was located, on visa wait. They are delighted to the point of tears. You've probably never seen such devoted readers in your life." This is more meaningful than you would suppose. The Baltic saints have had the Book of Mormon available to them only in Russian. Most can read Russian, but it's a hated language here, as he put it. It is a testimony of its truthfulness and the validity of its sacred nature that the Book of Mormon is accepted at all by these people. And more than accepting it, they have grown to love it in spite of the language in which it is written. How much more will they love it as they read it in their own tongue? Thank you.